Where do you get your news? Maybe you get served trending topics by the TikTok algorithm, or you search for high quality educational videos on YouTube. There's an overwhelming amount of information out there, and where you get your news can affect everything from how you view a complex social issue to whether you understand when someone says bet, which I do not. 20 years ago, you might have read the newspaper or watched a daily talk show. Social media was simpler. We weren't all doom scrolling late into the night. It was a different time. And 200 years ago, well, that's what we're talking about today. Because we can't understand all the changes that were happening in American politics during the 1820s and 30s without looking at what the 19th century considered high tech. I'm Dr. Danielle Bainbridge, and this is Study Hall, U.S. History to 1865. In the 18th century, people mostly communicated by letter or word of mouth. I know, right? Talking to people or writing? But it's true. There was no telegraph, no railroad, no telephone, and certainly no Zoom. Even newspapers weren't that widespread. By the time the Revolutionary War broke out in 1775, there were just about 36 newspapers in the colonies, most of them publishing weekly stories. And keep in mind, someone had to physically take those newspapers from wherever they were printed and deliver them somewhere else. As a result, communication technology was mostly dependent on transportation technology. The quickest way to travel in the late 1700s was over water. So it could be that someone living in Manhattan would receive news from London, England, which is over 3,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean, faster than news traveling only by land from a frontier settlement in Chicago, Illinois, only 800 miles away. Boats of any kind were fast, which was great for saving time and money. But river travel was the fastest of all. And coincidentally, cities like Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, New Orleans, and Cleveland were also on major waterways like the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. So when the US wanted a fast way to connect coastal cities like Boston and New York to inland places, we decided to straight up engineer new rivers. These artificial waterways, called canals, began to make boat travel possible in many more places. Arguably, the most important of these waterways was the Erie Canal, which began construction in 1817. This was the longest artificial river in the US, connecting the cities of Buffalo and Albany in New York. From there, goods could continue down the Hudson River to New York City, already one of the largest ports in the US, or continue across the Great Lakes to Cleveland, or down other rivers and canals to cities like Cincinnati, and the other way around. Suddenly, the time and cost to ship things cross-country dropped drastically, which meant we could ship more and more things. In 1837, just almost 700,000 tons were moved along the canal, which jumped to over 1 million tons in 1845. But even though boats were the stars of the 18th century and early 19th century travel, land transportation was getting better too. In the 1800s, roads went up across the country to help all those travelers on foot, on horseback, or maybe a wagon if they were lucky. For instance, in 1810, New York had just 1,000 miles of road. In 1820, that number quadrupled to 4,000 miles of road. Travelers between big cities were often treated to rough rides. Sometimes, the road was just a dirt rut that could get incredibly sludgy. It wasn't ideal. But even so, these muddy, rocky roads were a huge step up from navigating through forests, across grasslands, and over mountains on your own. All of these canals and roads, along with the railroads we learned about earlier in the series, helped connect the country over land. More people and stuff were on the move, and that meant ideas were too. For some Americans, this spread of ideas made it easier to imagine themselves as part of a unified nation. But even if you know what someone is thinking, that doesn't mean you're on the same page as them. So as more news traveled faster across the country, that set the stage for more people and their different worldviews to clash. All of this technological change was happening exactly when the country was changing politically. Remember our old friends, the Federalists? Well, say goodbye. After the War of 1812, the Federalist Party collapsed. Support had grown for other national parties over the course of the war, and it really didn't help that the New England members of the Federalist Party held a secret meeting where they discussed the possibility of secession. Obviously, they didn't do a great job keeping that a secret. Oops. By the election of 1820, the Federalist Party didn't win a single state, and that loss marked the end of the first party system, which is the period when the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans dominated politics. The Democratic Republicans were the only party left, so everyone got along and the United States lived happily ever after. The end. Just kidding. Imagine if one of the American political parties went away today. People would still find plenty to disagree about. In the 1800s, there were a lot of disagreements, discussions, and compromises about how new states or territories should be added, particularly around slavery. And by that I mean, enslaved or formerly enslaved people clearly opposed forced labor, but a lot of white people twiddled their thumbs. Some had moral issues with slavery, but many were more concerned about how it would lower wages for whites or keep poor white farmers from purchasing land. Alongside all that, every new state got 2 senators and a handful of representatives depending on its population. So every new state could affect the makeup of Congress, and therefore all the tariff-creating, trade agreement making, and tax setting that Congress does. One of the hottest new state debates began when Missouri first petitioned for admission to the US in 1817. Missouri very much wanted to allow slavery, but if Congress let that happen, it would upset the tenuous balance between the 11 pro-slavery states and the 11 anti-slavery states. Rather than, address the issue of slavery head-on, Congress took a page out of the Founding Fathers' playbook. They kicked the can down the road and we got the Missouri Compromise, an agreement to admit Missouri as a state that allowed slavery, but also admit Maine as a state that prohibited slavery. That way, the number of pro- and anti-slavery states remained even. The Missouri Compromise also outlawed slavery above the 36-degree 30-minute latitude line in the remainder of the Louisiana Territory. Altogether, this solved absolutely nothing, and continued to give white people the inhumane power to exploit, abuse, and control Black people. As former President Thomas Jefferson observed, the Missouri question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once as the knell of the Union. At the same time, politics were becoming, in a sense, more popular. Not like winning a popularity contest or Glinda's I'll show you what shoes to wear kind of popular. Popular as in the Latin word popularis, meaning belonging to the people. By the 1830s, most states had eliminated any property requirement to vote. So politics started shifting away from being dominated by elites with lots of money or land and moved a little more towards everyday people, aka poor white men. It's still the 1800s though, so that means no enslaved people were voting, and with the exception of a few states for a brief period of time, women and free people of color didn't have the right to vote either. Because news was traveling faster, your everyday adult white man could consume more news from various sources, and my oh my, were there sources. Remember when we said there were about 36 different newspapers in 1775? By 1830, that number had grown to 900. Most of these papers were still publishing weekly, but there was dramatic growth in the daily papers, and many were organized around a specific party or candidate, with journalists who didn't try to write unbiased articles. So information and opinions were flying like never before, more people could vote, and America was primed for some pretty huge elections. Let's start with the presidential election of 1824. At this point, party caucuses still decided presidential nominees. This was mainly because the founders didn't have parties and didn't set up an official nominating process in the Constitution. The Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans, who were the only caucus left, nominated William Crawford, someone you've probably never heard of because he very much did not win. Several other candidates stepped up to challenge Crawford, including some names that might be more familiar: Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, and Andrew Jackson. In the end, Jackson won more of the nation's popular vote, but didn't win a majority of the electoral votes. In fact, none of the candidates did. This sent a clear message that something wasn't working, and Congress made adjustments so it would never happen again. Just kidding. Again. As required by the Constitution, the decision went to the House of Representatives, and John Quincy Adams won the House's vote to be president. Without getting too into the weeds, Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House, threw his weight behind Adams. Adams, in turn, nominated Clay as Secretary of State. So there was a whole lot of wink wink nudge nudge going on. Jackson smelled something fishy. He and his supporters called the trade a corrupt bargain, and that title kind of stuck with Clay. Of course, it helped that dozens of pro-Jackson newspapers across the country constantly reminded everyone about this corrupt bargain. All of Adams' ambitious plans for the US, including building a national observatory and national university, didn't really work out. And 4 years later, in 1828, Jackson ran for president again. If you're tired of seemingly endless presidential campaigns, you can thank him and this 19th century communication boom. Politics became as much about entertainment as it was about governing. After all, this was the age of popular elections. Politics was about declaring who you liked, who you hated, and who you were, as much as it was about declaring your support for particular policies. And Jackson was willing to give the people what they wanted. His supporters circulated tons of pro-Jackson newspapers around the country using wagons, trains, and riverboats. And he won the election in 1828 in a landslide, 178 electoral votes to 83. Policy-wise, Jackson said he was all about the common people's interests, so long as by common you understand he meant white men. After all, he supported the expansion of slavery, and he championed the forced removal of indigenous nations from their homelands so that there was more room for white farmers to move west. And while the Panic of 1837 occurred during Martin Van Buren's presidency and was originally blamed on him, eventually it became clear that Jackson's wars on the Bank of the United States was a major factor in its eventual failure. Needless to say, Jackson had as many critics as he did passionate supporters, which led to entirely new political parties. His supporters started forming the Democrats, and eventually his critics formed the Whig Party. The Whigs named themselves after the 18th century British politicians who opposed the monarchy's expanding power. They called Jackson King Andrew and criticized him for being too powerful, even though he claimed to be an ordinary person. They believed that the government should have an active role in the economy and supported morality causes like temperance. And now that there were multiple political parties competing to various degrees instead of one, a new era in American politics was born, the second party system. Even though the team names changed in the switch from the first party system to the second, some core arguments didn't, like the arguments about slavery. And people kept communicating their opinions on those arguments faster and faster as the 1800s went on. Maybe not as fast as a tweet, but you get the idea. As a result, the divides between people got even sharper. And while some disagreement is part of being human, these kinds of ideological divides are a recipe for major conflicts, as we can see historically and in the US today. But we'll pick up that thread in the next episode. Thanks for watching Study Hall US History to 1865, which is part of the Study Hall Project, a partnership between ASU and Crash Course. If you like this video and want to keep learning with us, be sure to subscribe. You can learn more about Study Hall and the videos produced by Crash Course and ASU in the links in the description. See you next time.